Hello and welcome to the Thursday, August 28th, 2025 edition of the SANS Internet Storm Center's Stormcast. My name is Johannes Ulrich, recording today from Baltimore, Maryland. And this episode is brought to you by the SANS.edu Bachelor's Degree Program in Applied Cybersecurity. Xavier today published a diary describing an interesting technique to launch shellcode. Now, typically when an attacker is attempting to execute code after gaining some access to the system, the attacker will allocate some memory, or mark it as executable, then copy their code into that memory, and then launch that code. Now, this typically launches the code in the context of the current threat, but of course there are other techniques to also inject it into another threat. Problem with this technique is it's, very common, very well known, and as a result, it's also often flagged by various EDR tools. What Xavier came across is a slight deviation of this, where the attacker in the end does execute the code by actually calling a Windows API CallWindowProcA. CallWindowProcA is meant to call various internal Windows functions, but the way the function works, it actually, just accepts any memory pointer to then basically execute code at that location. So an attacker can use that to execute their code after copying it in the memory, so it's not limited just to execute various part of the Windows operating system's code. Interesting technique, and apparently works quite well the way sort of Xavier observed it here, and yes, may be used to bypass some EDR tools. And yes, we sadly have yet another supply chain compromise incident. This time the problem is the NX build tool. This is a popular build tool that's being used by developers to basically optimize how software is tested and built after you make changes to the software. Semcrab has a great blog post summarizing what happened here. So the NX tool was compromised. Any developer downloading the compromised version then had a telemetry.js file executed as part of the install procedure. This telemetry.js file actually used Gemini AI or Claude, if installed, in order to search the developer's system for secrets. They were particularly going after cryptocurrency-related secrets, but also things like deploy keys and the like. So essentially anything that can help the attacker to either steal cryptocurrency or further compromise the software that the developer was working on. This data was then exfiltrated to GitHub. There was a new repository that was then being added as part of the victim's GitHub account, and the secrets were posted to this repository. It's overall an interesting event. First of all, having such a major tool being compromised. Apparently, it's used by 2.5 million developers. Not sure if that's just number of downloads or actual users. And around 1,000 or so developers appear to have been affected and had their credentials actively stolen based on some searches on GitHub. Both NX and GitHub have responded, so you won't find these repositories on GitHub anymore. Also, there's an updated version of NX that removes the malicious code here. I haven't seen any details how NX was compromised, so whether it was just one of those usual, leaked password kind of incidents, or if there was anything more to it. But given that this particular attacker is very much into stealing credentials, it's very possible that in an earlier attack, they were able to gain a hold of the NX developer's credentials. Not much you can actually do here from a victim's point of view. Yes, I could say, hey, review whatever code you're downloading, but NX is a well-respected, frequently used tool, so you shouldn't really have any suspicion here when you're using this tool. It's also a fairly complex tool, so it's not a tool where you easily just could review the code and make sure that it hasn't been really tampered with. And a number of law enforcement and cybersecurity agencies worldwide have collaborated on a real great and detailed write-up on the incident has often been referred to as Volt Typhoon, among other names. This is basically a compromise of various telco and other companies by Chinese state-sponsored actors. And this write-up goes over quite a bit of detail how, for example, initial access worked. Well, no surprise here, the hacker's best friend. They love it if you spend a lot of money on security devices like Palo Alto and Cisco. And then, of course, also Ivanti is what they always love to gain access to your network. Also, a couple things here stick out from sort of a defensive point of view. For example, network monitoring, one of my favorite things, like the use of GRE and IPsec tunnels, which should in most networks, in particular GRE tunnels, raise an alert because they're not really that commonly used. And if, well, you should really know what GRE and IPsec tunnels are expected in your particular network. So a real good write-up, very technical, so hands-on kind of things you can look for, things that can inform your detection and threat hunting. Well, and that's it for today. So thanks again for listening and talk to you again tomorrow. Bye.